Fallen One, Inner Demon, by Silas Kimola. Chapter 1. Ignition. In the small city of Dorian, September 21st, 1989. It was a mistake to fight back. It probably would have been a better idea not to have said anything to them. When a couple of kids who are older and bigger make fun of you, the best thing to do is to look at the ground and keep walking. Ilvin didn't think ahead, though. A 7th grader named Morgan, who's nearly twice his size, had been picking on him for over a year now. Today, when Morgan made fun of his clothes, Ilvin threw back an insult about his weight. The older boy and his friend, both being overweight, took offense to this and decided Ilvin needed to be taught a lesson. Morgan, with his dirty blonde bowl cut and almost full-toothed grin, walked up to Ilvin and slapped him across the face. In response, Ilvin wound up and punched Morgan in the stomach. It was an insult without injury, and now he was running from Morgan and his friend Gunter, a slightly shorter and chubbier boy who sported a spiked hairdo that was a few inches shorter in the front than the back. The two boys probably amounted to 4 times Ilvin's weight. Fortunately, this meant that they couldn't outrun him, but they didn't give up easily. They chased him for over 20 minutes, and by the time they gave up and turned around, Ilvin was over halfway home. He kept running for a few more blocks to be on the safe side and then stopped to catch his breath. Looking around, he decided that going all the way back to the schoolyard to collect his bike would be more trouble than it was worth. The ride to school each morning was an easy one and only took about 10 minutes, but the ride home was mostly uphill and could take up to half an hour. Trudging home slowly, he considered his afternoon activity. Being Thursday meant that he didn't have to make deliveries for either of his paper routes, which was a plus considering he didn't have his bike with him. Fleeing for as long as he did left him exhausted, with sweat still beading down his face and soaking his blonde hair, which was just long enough to get into his eyes. Being short for his age and skinnier than most kids certainly had its disadvantages, and he knew from previous experience that seeking a solution from teachers after being bullied always produced the same speech about being a man and standing up for yourself. Ilvin couldn't understand why he was being told to act like a man when he was only 10 years old and now regretted taking the advice about standing up for himself. It could certainly sound like a good idea in stories that start with, "When I was your age," or "Back in my day," and end with both sides shaking hands and becoming friends, but in reality, it only proved to make a bad situation worse. Maybe hurrying home and searching the cupboards for junk food and watching some cartoons might be a good plan for unwinding, possibly followed by going to the arcade and spending some hard-earned paper route money on a few video games. Devereaux Court. In a duplex in a project called Devereaux Court, a man named Ross prepares for a road trip. Every couple of months, he leaves with a dozen members of his motorcycle club for about a week. The objective is to pick up a large quantity of speed to bring back to their small city for distribution. Of course, they always use a bit for themselves to stay awake and alert on their long rides. Typically, each member who rides will pick up 1 pound and bring it back to their chapter clubhouse where it can be processed for sales. Ross's wife, Ruth, had voiced her disapproval of his drug runs on more than one occasion. She had heard stories and even read an article about American motorcycle clubs like Hell's Angels and Outlaws having deadly cross encounters and turf wars. Ross had assured his wife that there was no reason to worry. His motorcycle club, Berserker, was the only club that operated on their route in the city. Therefore, there was no competition in Dorian or along their 1,000-mile-long road trip. Ross, who was sometimes seen as scary by the neighbors due to his large build and full-sleeve tattoos depicting axe-wielding barbarians and horror movie icons, tied back his shoulder-length blonde hair and put the last of his things in his motorcycle bag. After putting on his leather vest, which brandished a skull and a horned helm for a club logo, he was all set to go with the exception of his automatic. Normally, Ross asked his wife for assistance when he couldn't find something, but admitting to Ruth that he'd misplaced his firearm had got him in hot water before, mainly due to the possibility that their boy could find it and hurt himself. Ross went upstairs to the bedroom to see if he had left it in the dresser drawer. Ruth, a short 29-year-old, was there, brushing her long dark hair as she was getting ready for the evening shift at the day and night cafe. "Are you leaving soon? Would you be able to drop me off at work?" Ross found his weapon and put it in his vest as he denied his wife's request. "No. Our rendezvous is at the clubhouse. It's in the opposite direction." Ruth put a notepad in her apron and looked around for her pen. "I know. It's just a long walk there, and I'm already going to be on my feet for 8 hours, plus the walk home after." "There's 12 guys waiting there for me, Ruth," Ross interrupted, "and I'm already late. You've got time to walk to work." Ruth walked downstairs to the living room without saying anything. She had been in enough arguments with her husband to know where it would lead. Ross took a breath and followed her, not wanting to leave his wife angry at him. He attempted to cool the situation as Ruth was tying her shoes. "I can drop you off if you want, but we'll have to leave right now." Before she could say anything, the front door opened and their son walked in and headed straight for the stairs leading up to his room, trying unsuccessfully not to be noticed. Ruth stopped him halfway to the stairs. "Ilvin, what's that on your face?" The boy ran his hands down either side of his face and looked at them. "There's nothing on my face." She hurried over for a closer look. "There's a handprint. Did you get into a fight at school?" His dad took a sudden interest. "Did you fuck him up?" Ruth whipped around with disapproval. "Ross!" She turned to her son. "Are you being bullied?" "It's Ilvin who should be doing the bullying," Ross chimed in with more unwanted input. "It was a big dullard named Morgan," he answered, attempting to interrupt a potential fight. "He made fun of how I was dressed, probably because we're poor." With a sad look, Ruth started to wish that she could have been there to say something to Morgan, not realizing she would only have made things worse for her little boy. "What did he say to you?" Looking at the floor, his response was quiet. "He asked me why I dress like a gay orphan." Ross laughed so hard he almost teared up. "You know what, Ross? Go meet your friends. I can make it to work on my own. See you when you get back." Ross picked up his side bags and walked out the door, still chuckling. After the door shut, Ruth turned back to Ilvin, hoping to do something to make things a little bit better for him. "Well, maybe we could go somewhere and get you a few things at the clothing store. We don't have much money. We couldn't be able to do anything fancy, but we could get you something that's new instead of secondhand this time." He appreciated his mom's effort, but had other ideas. "I don't want anything fancy. I don't even care about secondhand. Guys like Morgan will use any excuse to pick on someone smaller. Can't I take karate lessons?" Ruth shook her head. "No way, we've talked about this. We can't afford it, not to mention the fact that I don't like this martial arts obsession of yours. It's in all your TV shows and movies and video games, people breaking boards on their heads, kicking each other through windows, and then I see you and the neighbor kids in the front yard practicing your kung fu kicks on each other." She felt a tangent coming on and decided to wrap it up. "And in case you were wondering, I haven't forgotten the time you, Jed, and Sherman made ninja stars in the garage at Sherman's house and got caught taking them to school. You've got enough bad ideas in your head, and I'm not going to pay some martial artist teacher to make it worse." Ilvin sat on the couch and looked at the TV. "All right." She sat next to him. "Well, do you want to get a couple of new shirts or pants or something?" Ilvin wasn't interested. "No thanks. Could I maybe just have a few quarters to go to the arcade?" Ruth's eyes widened. "What arcade?" He kept his gaze fixed on the TV. "There's only one arcade in town, Mom." Ruth stood up. "You are not going to Bronta." "Why not?" he asked, playing dumb. The boy's poor mother could feel another tangent coming on. "Someone got stabbed there last week. Don't tell me that you didn't know about it, and don't pretend that you don't remember me telling you that you're not allowed to go there." He tried for plan B. "What about standing room only? Nothing ever happens there, and it's barely 2 blocks away." After taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly, she pulled half a dozen quarters out of her purse and handed them to her child. "That's all that I can give you. I need the rest for my float at work." "Thanks," he said as he grabbed the quarters and ran out the door. Ruth got just a few minutes of peace and quiet as she finished getting ready for work. Not wanting to arrive too early, she sat back for a few minutes and watched the news. In today's news, a break-in took place at Hawthorne Munition Plant in Nevada. Authorities say that they are unsure of how many were involved, but it is confirmed that the ordeal ended with 2 very large explosions, each with a blast radius nearly the size of the city block. There are no confirmed reports for suspects, but for now, allegations have ranged from Russian spies and potential World War III to Roswell-style UFO crashes. Ruth giggled at the UFO suspicion before she turned off the TV and left for work. Perhaps this will make for amusing conversation with the girls at the diner. Elsewhere in the Devereaux Court, Ilvin knocked on the door of one of the neighboring units in the Devereaux Court. His freckly dark-haired friend Jed answered the door and accepted the invite to go to standing room only for a few games. Wearing their mildly frayed denim jackets, they ambled toward the nearby hangout. It was a consolation prize to go to the corner store that only had 4 arcade games, but, like Ilvin, Jed was not permitted to go to Bronta after his mom read in the paper that someone was stabbed there. It was generally agreed that the incident had to be gang-related, though not anything to do with the Berserker Club. Berserker was comprised of adults who were old enough to hang out in bars and cause trouble there. They spent much of their time in the garages and clubhouses and had no interest in video arcades. The only gang that hung around Bronta was one made up of mostly teenagers called Undead. Maybe to a senior citizen, the two gangs would be indistinguishable, with the torn jeans and leather jackets, as well as the aura of cigarette smoke and coarse language. But for a group that's been known to carry sharp weapons and sometimes pose a threat to the undead, actually had its origins in an interest of safety. 4 years ago, a few smaller gangs, some consisting of no more than half a dozen members, found themselves on the receiving end of the verbal abuse and sometimes assault from berserkers. No one was sure what prompted the aggression, but a few of the gangs had decided to get together to see if the solution could be thought up to force the bikers to tone down their hostility. A meeting was held at the old Aeon Theater during the final showing of Return of the Living Dead. Unlike the opening night, the final showing always has the smallest turnout, and only invitees from the meetings of the gangs were present. Almost 60 teenagers from 5 local gangs sat awkwardly in a somewhat circular formation discussing options for truce and temporary alliances against Berserker. Uncoordinated banter, muddled with the surround sound of brain-hungry zombies, carried on for over half an hour before it was eventually interrupted. "Where's the corpse at?" the leader of one of the gangs shouted out while standing in front of the big screen with raised fists clenched around fingerless gloves. Almost everyone there recognized him as Tyrant, a beefy teenager with a blue mohawk who was the leader of the Impalers. Tyrant followed up with the audience, who was now silent. "Who wants to be a corpse?" "They haven't killed anyone yet," a voice shouted from the crowd. Tyrant quickly responded, "Wrong! They haven't killed any of our members, but they have killed, and last week they put one of my own in the hospital." A few people there already knew what Tyrant was talking about. An Impaler member named Crash had crossed paths with and said the wrong thing to a berserker who had drank too much whiskey. The berserker's response was to pull out a buck knife and stick it to the mouthy teenager in the lung. It was a story that everyone in Dorian was familiar with. Tyrant continued his speech and slowly convinced the gangs that they were in more danger than they realized and that conflict with the bikers would get worse before it got better. The solution to the problem would be unification. Rather than a truce or any other temporary fix, everyone at the meeting would dissolve their old gangs and put aside any differences they had, permanently. Undead had officially formed, and every member donned new back patches depicting somewhat defleshed skulls with bloodshot eyeballs. Years later, some people here and there, some of the local media, some of the law enforcement, would try to learn the origins of the gang's name and would get various answers. Some stated that it was because Tyrant had warned that their rivals would make corpses of them if they remained as separate, smaller gangs. Some others said that the name was inspired by Return of the Living Dead playing on the big screen during their meeting. A young prospect for membership once decided that he would go to the source and ask Tyrant himself, but upon inquiry had learned that back in 87, Tyrant was found face down in the middle of Gate Street with a bullet hole in the back and tire tracks on his corpse. What some believed to be a forced peace between Undead and Berserker MC now resembled a Cold War. Berserker had proven they don't mind getting confrontational with a gang they considered to be mouthy punk teenagers, but everyone was getting a little older, an advantage for some entering their 20s, but not so much for those in their 40s. Undead slightly outnumbered Berserker, at least in terms of local chapter, which seemed to be all that mattered. A request for outside assistance against a gang of kids half their age would be a disgraceful one. Unlike Berserker, Undead appeared to be willing to keep to themselves. They mostly just wanted to hang out at the arcades and pool halls and look for places where they could drink and party with little chance of the police showing up. A couple of Undead, it seems, are willing to take their chances today and are having a couple of beers in front of the standing room-only corner store. The motive of coming to a somewhat busy area was clear as each of them was opening a fresh pack of cigarettes. One had shaggy blue hair and the other, appearing to have shaved his head with a razor, used a safety pin for a nose ring. They were easily spotted half a block away as Ilvin and Jed neared the store. When they came within earshot of the Undead, the boys' conversation diminished, and they looked toward the ground. The two elementary students had no specific fear of the gang, but like most, generally regarded them as being unpredictable. As they entered the store, anticipating some arcade games and socializing with whoever was hanging out, Ilvin was apparently a little too focused at keeping his head down and walked right into his classmate, Takashi. He looked up and apologized for his clumsiness. "Hey, sorry, I didn't see you. What are you doing here?" His spiky-haired Japanese friend responded while chewing gum and sorting through sticky cards. "Just buying some wacky packs. You doing all right? Kinda looked like you were running for your life after school today." Jed's ears perked up. "Running for your life? What happened?" "Nothing happened. I just had to run away from Morgan and Gunter," he said defensively. It's not like I was in any danger. Outrunning a couple of chunky fucks like them isn't exactly difficult. Language! A warning came from behind the cash register as the curly-haired staff, Brenda, put down her cigarettes to point to a sign there near the arcade machines prohibiting any swearing. He apologized for the rule breaking and then continued. I don't know what Morgan's problem is. He picks on everyone, but he's been singling me out for like a year now. Takashi offered some insight. Wasn't it about a year ago when he made fun of your name in front of class, so you called him Big M, Little Oregon? I guess. He thought about it for a second. He started the whole thing, though. I can't wait until next year when he's in junior high and I won't have to look at his ugly face. Takashi laughed. No, he'll probably fail and be around for another year. Ilvin rolled his eyes and gave his friend the finger, making sure the gesture was at an angle where Brenda couldn't see it. He laughed again. All right. I can't hang around for too long. My dad's expecting me. I'll see you at school tomorrow, he said as he zipped his blue windbreaker and walked out the door. The two waved goodbye to their friend and headed for the arcade games, but after only a few steps, Ilvin looked down and found 3 loose sticker cards, the same kind Takashi had just bought. He picked them up and showed them to Jeb. Hey, you think these might be Takashi's? Jed nodded. He probably dropped them when you bumped into him. He turned and looked toward the exit. We should go give them to him. Yeah, he probably hasn't gotten far. The two exited the store and hung a left. Suddenly, Ilvin's breath was knocked out of him, and he dropped the cards as he fell to his hands and knees. Unable to inhale, his eyes turned bloodshot and started to water. After a few seconds, he started to breathe a little. Putting his feet back to the ground, he tried to stand, and as he looked up through blurred vision, he saw Morgan looking down, grinning and clenching a fist. This was not good. He was in no condition to run, and he was unable to speak. Not that saying anything right now would be of any good anyway. Morgan was noticeably elated that he wasn't having all the fun. Gunter was beside him and decided to walk past Ilvin to crack Jed across the temple with a closed fist. He grabbed him by the throat before he could fall to the ground. Morgan stepped closer. Well, look who it is. Now you'll get the comeuppance that you dodged earlier. Of course, we already made up for you running away by going back to the school and mangling your bike, but since you're here now, we might as well smack you around a little just so you don't forget your place. Ilvin tried to back away, but Morgan kicked him in the chest, knocking him on his back. Morgan grabbed him by the foot and twisted his ankle. He screamed in pain while Morgan grinned and reveled in torment. Don't worry, I'll stop twisting when I hear the bones snap. Ilvin did hear the loud sound of a bone fracture, followed immediately by Morgan releasing the grip of his ankle. He looked up, confused, as he watched Morgan buckle at his knees and tilt his head down over cupped hands that were quickly filling with blood. He collapsed onto a sitting position, and behind him was Takashi in a fighting stance. Morgan was dumbfounded. He'd never been stood up to before, and now he'd been struck so hard that he was going into shock. Gunter dropped Jed to the sidewalk and marched up to Takashi. Let's see how this works out for you when you're face to face, you sneaky little puke. Gunter seemed certain that Takashi's only possible advantage over Morgan was approaching him unseen and unheard. Gunter was to be disappointed. As he clenched his fists and threw a right hook with all force he had, Takashi arched back just enough so the punch had no contact. As the arm was directly above him, Takashi shifted his weight, pivoting on the balls of each foot, and thrust his left fist upward, striking Gunter just below the shoulder. Gunter stumbled back as his arm hung at his sides, broken and useless. The pain was too much for him. He fell to the sidewalk and screamed. Ilvin looked at Takashi with disbelief. Takashi helped him up, and then Jed, but it was apparent that he did not want to stick around. Are you guys all right? I only came back because I thought I lost some of my cards, but now I'm late and my dad's going to be pissed. Jed looked at the bullies and their injuries. Though certainly not life-threatening, they were the most brutal things that they'd ever seen. These guys need help. We should get them an ambulance or something. Are you out of your fucking mind? Ilvin was not impressed by the suggestion. Did that punch to the head give you amnesia? Jed started toward the store entrance. I know that it sounds stupid, but I just think that we'll get in a ton of shit if we run away without doing anything to help. I'm going to go inside and ask Brenda to call an ambulance. Takashi turned to make his departure. You guys do what you want. I can't be any later than I already am. Come on, we have to get out of here, Ilvin pleaded as Jed entered the store. We can't be hanging around like this. You're crazy. Jed looked back and yelled at his friend. No, this is freaking me out. I'm not going anywhere. Ilvin looked around and noticed a couple of pedestrians across the street had stopped to observe what was happening. Additionally, a car had slowed down and appeared to be pulling over. Not wanting any part of it, he ran down Nord Street and turned left on St. Carbel Street, the same direction taken by Takashi, who could still be seen a couple blocks down the road, jogging, probably to make up for lost time. Ilvin began to sprint down the dimly lit sidewalk, trying to move at least a bit faster so that he could eventually catch up. He looked back periodically as he pursued his friend down 5 blocks of his shaded and quiet neighborhood. When he was trailing just a few feet behind, Takashi stopped and turned around in front of his house that was noticeably different from all the others. He was angry. "Why are you following me?" Ilvin took a second to catch his breath, as if he was much more exhausted than Takashi. I need your help." He glanced to his left and wondered why this property was surrounded by stone walls rather than iron fence that seemed to enclose almost every other property in sight. He looked up and noticed thin branches protruding with pink blossoms that he hadn't seen anywhere before, then looked back at Takashi, who was getting impatient. "No, you don't need any more help from me. You need to turn around and go home." Ilvin started to walk forward. "I do need your help. I need you to teach me to fight like you. When Morgan and Gunter recover, I know that they'll come after me. Can't you just teach me a little bit so I'm not defenseless?" Takashi extended a sidekick to Ilvin's chest, not to strike him, but to keep him from stepping closer. He got the impression Takashi didn't want him getting in front of the gate entrance, so he took a step back. "I'm in danger. Those two aren't going to forgive what happened to me." Takashi looked to his right toward the house, and his expression of annoyance turned to one of fear. "If you don't leave right now, we'll both be in danger." Takashi entered the front gate and made sure to lock it behind him before proceeding down the walkway. Ilvin looked around and wondered where to go from here. He looked back toward Nord Street and, deciding to get some distance from standing room only, continued fast-paced for a few blocks down St. Carbel Street, and then slowed at a regular pace when he deemed it safe. In contrast to Ilvin's home, only a few blocks away, the surroundings here were noticeably wealthier. Expensive houses, recessed in big yards, sometimes down along driveways and almost always behind high wrought iron fences. Visibility of the properties was reduced by foliage and evergreens along property lines, and it was not uncommon for ivy plants to grow and wrap themselves around the bars of the perimeter fences. Oak trees on either side of the street grew up so large that they formed a canopy above the road in an atmosphere that, under better circumstances, he usually considered to be calming. Continuing until he reached Dixon Road, he turned left and after 3 more blocks arrived back at his elementary school. His pace went from medium to sluggish. After hopping a chain-link fence and diagonally crossing the field, he started thinking about what Morgan said about mangling his bike. Not looking forward to seeing what type of damage his bike had taken and wanting to kill time as well, he started to move at a snail's pace. When he finally made his way to the bike rack on the opposite side of the building, he was upset to see that Morgan hadn't lied, the small consolation being that calling the bike mangled might have been a bit of an exaggeration. The wheels had been bent beyond repair and the bike cables had been ripped out, but the bike was certainly salvageable. He entered his 4-digit combination, 3615, to unlock the chain, and then wrapped it over his left shoulder and under his right arm, wearing it like a bandolier. Yesterday, Ilvin and Jed complained about having to pedal their bikes uphill on their way home from school every day. Now he was walking home, carrying his bike on his back. The trek home was going to be a difficult one. Back at Takashi's house. Takashi stood in his dojo as he did every morning for as far back as he could remember. This pre-dinner routine began by performing choreographed patterns of movements called katas. He began with his white belt katas, practicing basic blocks, straight punches, and front kicks, then proceeded through katas of every belt from white to black. His father, Sho, told him early in his training that even a master remembers the basics and practices them often. The dojo he trains in is part of a large add-on that connects to his home. This 20 by 20 foot room has decorations, some of which are centuries old. Weapons, scrolls, and statues of bird-looking humanoids called tengu that stand on each corner facing inward. In the middle of each wall stood 2 iron doors, 3 feet wide by 7 feet tall. The eastern doors connected to a narrow 8-foot by 24-foot tea room. The doors on the south side connected to 16-foot by 24-foot dining area. The west wall doors connected to the main house, and the doors on the north wall connected to the room containing little more than a large chair. Takashi's father refers to this as the throne room and uses it as a meditation chamber. Takashi understands that he is never to disturb his father when he is meditating. After practicing all of his katas, About 24 of them, he practices his strikes on thick board bound in manila rope, 200 punches with each hand followed by 200 kicks with each foot. Sho told his son he's going easy on him now. On the north wall of the dojo, a 1-foot square plate of iron is bolted to the wall about 4 feet above the floor. Sho punched it with each fist 1,000 times per day. Takashi does his training wearing a worn-out white karate gi, tied by a frayed black belt. Tonight, he's performing his exercises with a bit of nervousness. He's expected to be home by 4 o'clock every afternoon to practice his Shotokan techniques after dinner. This, combined with an equally long training of ninjutsu before breakfast every morning, is a family tradition going back many generations. Takashi was only a few minutes late to start his training today, but he was still worried that Sho might react to the late start with discipline. He was nearing the final repetitions of his routine when he halted. Sensing that he was being watched, he turned his eyes to the dojo entrance and saw his father watching him. "I did not tell you to stop." The boy continued where he left off, wondering what his father would say next. He didn't talk much in general, and those who knew him considered him to be emotionless. His face perpetually held a flat affect, and Takashi found him impossible to read. After another minute of silent observation, Sho began to question the boy. "You were late today. Why?" Takashi continued his practice as he answered. "I was almost home on time, but this kid from school was following me. He was bugging me with questions, so I had to tell him to go away." He observed his son's technique, looking for errors, but he didn't see anything too out of place. "What was he asking you?" With that, Takashi knew that he had given his father more information than he should have. He would have muttered a curse under his breath if not for the fact that Sho would certainly hear it. "He was getting picked on by a couple bigger kids, so I helped him out. After I left, he followed me and started asking for training in the martial arts." He thought that he might have seen his father's eyes widen, though he didn't dare turn to look at him. He wondered if he would be scolded for using his skill when he wasn't instructed to, and drawing attention to himself, not to mention letting someone follow him to the front gate of their house. To Takashi's surprise, Sho's response to his story was only one short question. "What is the boy's name?" Takashi was confused by the question, but knew better than to react with any question of his own. "His name's Ilvin." Sho closed the west wall doors and proceeded to the throne room. He stopped in front of the entrance and turned to his son. "Bring him to me." He then entered the throne room and closed the iron doors behind him. Now Takashi was confused. What could possibly make someone as secretive and reclusive as his father suddenly want to meet one of his school friends? He couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. He looked above the throne room doors where a photo hung. It was a younger Sho with 12 students from the days of his martial arts school. The photo was from 1975, a few years before Takashi was born. He never knew why his father closed the school. He had tried asking him about it a couple of times, but learned that those questions were unacceptable. Generally, his father was someone that needed to be interacted with cautiously. Knowing when not to disturb him and what boundaries not to cross was an essential part of daily living. But now he wanted him to bring over his hyperactive friend, who, in 5 years of school, had managed to be disliked by every teacher. The requested meeting was not one that he was looking forward to. The next morning at Devereux Court, Ilvin clumsily made his way down the stairs from his bedroom wearing his gray sweatpants and black t-shirt that he wore to bed every night. Heading through the living room into the kitchen, he approached the counter next to his mom, who was washing a few dishes. He grabbed a mug and poured himself a cup of coffee, but Ruth intercepted and took the cup from her son's hand. "Nope." Ilvin rubbed his eyes and ran his hand through his hair. "But Dad lets me have coffee." She added some cream and sugar and took a sip. "Yeah, well, your dad's not here, so tough shit. Besides, you know I don't like you drinking coffee even when he is around. You always get hyper off the caffeine, and then your dad tries to pin it on me, saying that I give you too much sugar." Ilvin threw a couple slices of bread in the toaster and took a margarine out of the fridge. "But I need the energy. By the time I walk all the way to school, I'll be tired again." She gave her son a confused look. "Why would you walk to school?" "Well, my bike got a little bit wrecked yesterday. I left it leaning against the side of the house if you want to go look for it." Ruth stepped out for a quick look and then came back inside, trying to understand what had happened. "Are you okay? How did that happen?" "I'm fine. Those kids who slapped me around after school yesterday also messed with my bike, just to be jerks." "Well, how come you didn't mention it yesterday?" "Because I didn't know." "How did you not know?" Ilvin took a deep breath and let it out slowly, something that he often had seen his parents do when they conversed. "It's a long story. Can I tell you after school? I only have a few minutes before I have to go and get ready." Ruth nodded. Yeah, I'll go next door and see if Margot will let me borrow her truck so that we can get it to the repair shop. Ilvin raised his knee and sprung to the ball of his feet at the lever on the toaster, sending the toast flying up and landing on the counter. Seriously, Ilvin? The boy responded as he took a bite. What? Don't play stupid. She used what was left of her coffee to wash down a couple of aspirin. It's too early for your kung fu bullshit, and I told you not to pull that crap in the house anyway. Now get dressed and go to school. He went upstairs as he finished with his toast, and Ruth returned to the sink to take care of the last few dishes. But before she could get her hands in the water, there was a knock at the door. She flung the dishcloth over her shoulder and went to see who was knocking. Much to her dismay, there were 2 police officers standing there. One white male, just over 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, accompanied by a shorter, black female with a slightly friendlier facial expression. Her first thought was that they must have shown up because of Ross and his gang's illegal activity. The man was the first to speak. Sorry to bother you. I'm Officer Pendle, and this is my partner, Officer Hobbs. Is your name Escola? She nodded. Yeah, Ruth Escola. She opened the door and motioned for the officers to come in. Pendle continued as they entered. We're here because there was a bit of an incident last night. Ruth's heart raced as her mild nervousness turned into fear. What kind of incident could bring the police to her front door unless something happened to her husband? Was there a motorcycle accident, or possibly some sort of gang violence? Just as Ruth was considering various catastrophes, Ilvin came hurrying down the stairs in his gray hoodie and black jeans with his backpack hanging on one shoulder. Paying little attention to his surroundings, he adjusted his hood just enough for his peripheral vision to notice the 2 strangers in blue uniforms. Suddenly, Ruth wasn't the only one in the room consumed by fear. Hobbs, believing herself to be less intimidating of the 2 officers, approached the boy. Is your name Ilvin Escola? The fear was almost paralyzing. He nodded to confirm Hobbs' inquiry. Were you involved in an incident outside standing room only last night? He chose his words carefully. You mean when those 2 bullies beat up me and my friend? Hobbs looked to her partner, then back at Ilvin. Well, yesterday, 2 boys were taken to the hospital by ambulance. We heard that you were involved. Can you give us your side of the story? Desperate for a last-minute exit strategy, Ilvin walked over to the front door and grabbed his shoes. If I don't leave right now, I'll be late for school. If your teacher has a problem with you being late, we can take care of it, Pendle chimed in with a bit of authority. Why don't you just have a seat and tell us what happened yesterday? Leaving his white high tops unlaced, he dropped his backpack and walked over to the couch to sit. He gave the police his detailed recollection of the previous day's events, starting with Morgan's instigating remarks in the schoolyard. Everything Ilvin recounted was honest, with the exception of Takashi, who he carefully excluded from his statement. He told the story as far as Gunter holding Jed by the throat and Morgan trying to break his ankles when he suddenly went silent. The 2 officers looked at him with suspicion, and Pendle grew impatient. Then what happened? Ilvin avoided eye contact and stared at the floor. Some guy came along and kicked Morgan in the head and punched Gunter in the arm. The policeman was noticeably annoyed with the sudden vagueness. Some guy? Who was he? I don't know. Well, what'd he look like? I couldn't tell you. The sun was in my eyes. Pendle became irate. Seriously, some guy shows up and saves the day and you couldn't see him? Did he pop out of a phone booth? Was he wearing a cape? Don, could you tone it down a bit? Hobbs intervened, giving Ilvin the impression that referring to her partner by his first name might be like when Ruth yelled at him and included his middle name. Pendle turned around and took a couple of steps. Hobbs spoke a bit slower and quieter with the boy and his mother, hoping to reduce some of the hostility her partner had put into the situation. Look, I'll be honest with you. We don't really know what to think. We got a report last night of an assault outside the SRO, and when we got there, a boy with a broken arm told us that he and his friends were ganged up on by 3 boys. Hobbs took out the notepad and sorted through some of what she had written down the day before. Gunter told us that you, Jed Verinder, and a 3rd boy ganged up and assaulted him and his friend Morgan. Jed was still at the scene when we arrived, and honestly, we found it hard to believe that he could have any involvement in injuring 2 beefy kids like Morgan and Gunter. He's too puny. We thought maybe you had more to do with it, Ilvin, but you're even smaller than he is. Now between you, Jed, and Gunter, no one's saying anything about the 3rd person involved. Ruth was trying to keep up with the events that were turning out to be much more serious and dangerous than she originally understood. What about the other one? The one who left his red handprint on my son's face? Did you say anything about this unknown person? Hobbs shook her head. No, Mrs. Escola. Morgan won't be saying anything for a while. We went to see him at the Dorian General Hospital this morning, and it turns out that his jaw was broken in 2 places and doctors had to wire his mouth shut. We plan to go and see him to communicate when we can, but it'll be a little while before he's coherent. He's on a lot of pain medication right now. Pendle turned toward Ilvin. Look, kid, I know you know more than you're telling us. We're not here to get you in trouble. It's just that the extent of the injuries those 2 guys went to the hospital with kinda has some people thinking that they have been assaulted by an adult. Our superior would like us to at least rule out that possibility. Could you help us? Ilvin shook his head without saying a word. Pendle began, breathing heavily through his nose. He looked left and right, scanning the living room. I've been here before. He looked at Ruth. Your husband's a biker, isn't he? One of those berserkers. He looked back at Ilvin. They don't like cops, and they don't like people who talk to cops. Maybe your dad told you never to talk to cops, too. I guess if you refuse to talk, there's not much that we can do. I'd hate to see you get bad ideas and start down the wrong path at such a young age, kid. I'll be keeping a close eye on you. Ilvin was afraid, but he didn't want to get Takashi in any trouble after he stood up for him. He remembered how worried he appeared when he stood in front of his house and asked him for training. It seemed like he wasn't allowed to bring other kids into his home. Ilvin could only imagine what kind of trouble he might be in if the cops showed up looking for him. The 2 officers left frustrated, and Ruth did her best to understand what just happened and wondered just how much Ilvin was holding back from her and the police. After the officers left, she arranged to borrow the neighbor's pickup truck and helped Ilvin load his bike in the back, planning to take it for repairs after she dropped him off at school. Partially, the motivation for driving him was to get him there on time, but the main reason was to see if she could get information about what had happened. Ruth didn't like being kept in the dark when her son was getting into dangerous situations. They were more than halfway to their destination before she finally broke the silence. You know, the cops don't believe you about that guy that put the 2 boys in the hospital. I don't either. It's pretty obvious that you're covering for somebody. You can tell me the truth, though. You can trust me. Ilvin didn't want to say anything, but he didn't want his mom to worry either. It's some guy I know from school. He's not anyone that you need to worry about, but I think it's best if I don't say who it is, for his sake. Ruth was getting fed up with her son's secrets. Well, what about the other kid? Gunter, is it? Why didn't he tell the cops his name? Wouldn't he want this kid to get in trouble? I don't know what's running through Gunter's head. He's probably afraid. He looked pretty scared when he got his arm broke. Seriously, Ilvin, this isn't a joke. The police were involved. What if your father was still home when they showed up? I didn't know that they were going to come over. You know that doesn't matter. You know your father wouldn't give a shit how or why they showed up. You need to be smarter, or we both get in trouble. She wanted to continue to try and find out exactly what happened, but had to accept that she was at a dead end. The ride ended without either of them saying another word until Ilvin tried to exit the vehicle, but his mom hugged him before he got out. Damn it, Mom. Let me go. People are going to see. She laughed a bit and waved as Ilvin ran to the schoolyard entrance. Normally, he didn't do too much running on his way to school, but he was hoping to find Jed or Takashi before the bell sounded. Ilvin! He turned to see who was calling his name and saw one of his friends approaching. Sherman! Have you seen Jed around? I gotta talk to him. No, but he called me last night and told me what happened at Standing Room. The 2 walked toward the school's main entrance as they talked. Yeah, the cops were at my place this morning asking all kinds of questions. Can you do me a favor and not talk to anyone about it? I'm not liking the heat. Sherman didn't understand. Heat? What are you talking about? Ilvin gave a condescending response. You know, heat? Unwanted attention from the cops? Hello? Hey, shut up. I didn't know, he said, mildly embarrassed. Well, didn't your dad teach you anything? Sherman responded with a short sentence in Cantonese. What did you just say? Oh, you don't know? Sorry, I forgot your parents only taught you 1 language. Ilvin tried to bring the conversation back a bit. Just don't talk to anyone about what Jed told you last night, all right? Sherman looked disappointed. Yeah, I guess so. I just wish that I could have been there to see it, though. Sherman threw a right punch into the air and followed by a left, then a jump kick. No one paid much mind, though. The only thing unusual about the display was that Ilvin wasn't joining in with some punches and jump kicks of his own. A little way off, Ilvin spotted Takashi, locking his bike up at the rack. He wanted to talk to him and warn him that the cops were looking for him. Hey, Sherman, I'll see you in class. I'm gonna go talk to Takashi. He nodded and then practiced a few more kicks for good measure. Ilvin ran to the bike rack and got there as Takashi was finishing locking up. He was just about to warn him about the cops, but then Takashi spoke first. He said okay. Ilvin took a couple of seconds to respond. Who said okay? Okay to what? After being momentarily distracted when he noticed Sherman flailing in the distance, he looked back to Ilvin and continued. My dad said I can bring you to our dojo. Ilvin was stunned. Bring me there for training? For real? I can't believe it! Takashi nodded and mumbled to himself. Same here.